May 7, 1945. Berchtesgaden, Bavaria. Sergeant William Martin of the 101st Airborne Division stood in what remained of Adolf Hitler's private residence, the Berghof, smoke still rising from sections of the building that had been hit by Allied bombing raids days earlier. The walls that had hosted Chamberlain, Mussolini, and countless Nazi officials now stood broken, exposed to the spring air. German troops had retreated. SS guards had fled or surrendered. And in the chaos of those final days, as the Third Reich collapsed, American soldiers moved through rooms that had been the inner sanctum of Nazi power. Martin, 23 years old, from a small town in Ohio, had been with the 101st since Normandy. He'd jumped into France on D-Day, fought through the hedgerows, survived Market Garden, held the line at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. He'd seen enough combat to last several lifetimes. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was about to find in a relatively undamaged study on the second floor of Hitler's mountain retreat. The room was smaller than he expected. A desk, some chairs, bookshelves partially emptied by fleeing staff or earlier looters. Allied intelligence teams would arrive soon to catalog everything of potential value, documents, maps, anything that might reveal Nazi secrets or war crimes. But in those first hours of occupation, before the systematic searches began, individual soldiers moved through the Berghof taking what they found, sometimes official souvenirs, often simple looting. Martin wasn't looking for treasure. He'd seen too many men killed to care much about Nazi silverware or stolen paintings. But he was curious about who Hitler had been as a person, what the private spaces of the man who had caused so much destruction looked like. So he opened drawers carefully, methodically, the way he'd been trained to check buildings for booby traps. In the bottom drawer of the desk, beneath some loose papers and a folded map, his hand touched leather. He pulled out a photo album, bound in dark leather, surprisingly well-made, the kind of personal item that seemed out of place in a dictator's residence. The kind of thing someone's grandmother might keep on a coffee table. He opened it, and what he saw made him close it immediately, look around to make sure no one else was in the room, then open it again to confirm what he'd seen. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The photographs were not what he expected. They were not propaganda images, not official state photographs, not the kind of carefully staged Nazi imagery that had flooded the world for 12 years. These were personal, candid, intimate. Photographs of Hitler at the Berghof in casual clothes, sitting with his German shepherd, walking in the mountains, having tea on the terrace. Photographs of Eva Braun, Hitler's long-secret companion, smiling at the camera, sunbathing, playing with dogs. Photographs of Nazi officials in relaxed moments, without uniforms, without the rigid formality of official functions. And there were older photographs. Hitler as a young man in Vienna. Hitler during the First World War, in a German army uniform, looking impossibly young. Photographs from the early days of the Nazi Party. Men Martin now recognized as Goebbels, Goering, Himmler, but younger, thinner, looking like ambitious political activists rather than architects of genocide. Martin stood in that room, holding something he immediately understood was historically significant. This was not military intelligence. This was not evidence of war crimes, at least not directly. But it was a window into Hitler's private life, a glimpse behind the public persona that the Nazi propaganda machine had so carefully constructed. The kind of material historians would want, journalists would want, prosecutors might want. And Martin's first instinct was to keep it secret. This decision, made in a moment, in a half-destroyed house in the Bavarian Alps, would shape the rest of his life. He would carry that photo album back to his unit, pack it carefully in his duffel bag, ship it home to Ohio with his other belongings, and tell no one. Not his commanding officers. Not his fellow soldiers. Not, for many years, even his wife. The question that would haunt historians decades later was simple. Why? Why would a soldier who had risked his life fighting Nazi Germany, who had seen concentration camps, who knew what the Third Reich had done, choose to keep this piece of history hidden? Why not turn it over to intelligence? Why not donate it to a museum? Why keep it locked in a closet for 50 years? The answer, Martin would eventually explain, was complicated. Part of it was legal concern. In 1945, the rules about wartime souvenirs were murky. Soldiers were allowed to take certain items as trophies, German helmets, flags, badges, personal weapons from surrendered soldiers. But there were also strict rules against looting, particularly of valuable items or official documents. Martin wasn't sure which category a personal photo album fell into. He knew that if he turned it over to his superiors, he might face questions about how he'd obtained it, whether he'd been looting, whether he'd taken other items he wasn't supposed to have. But there was something else, something Martin struggled to articulate even to himself at the time. A sense that this album was too personal, too intimate to be turned into a public spectacle immediately. These are photographs of human beings, however monstrous their actions. Hitler playing with a dog, Eva Braun laughing at something off camera, Göring looking relaxed and almost jovial. The banality of it disturbed Martin in a way that official Nazi imagery never had. The propaganda photographs showed Hitler as a Superman, a leader of destiny, a figure of historical importance. These photographs showed him as a man who liked dogs and mountain walks and apparently had a girlfriend who enjoyed sunbathing. The disconnect was profound. How could the person in these photographs have ordered the deaths of millions? How could the man having tea on a terrace have started a war that killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people? Martin put the album in his bag. He packed his gear. He left the Berghof with the rest of his unit. And he began the process of trying to return to normal life, a process that would prove more difficult than any combat he'd experienced. The 101st Airborne remained in Europe through the summer of 1945. They were stationed in Austria, helping to manage displaced persons, maintain order, begin the enormous task of processing German prisoners, and sorting out the chaos of Central Europe in the immediate aftermath of Nazi collapse. Martin carried the photo album with him through all of this, sometimes taking out to look at the images, trying to understand what they meant, try to reconcile the human faces in the photographs with the inhuman system they had served. He was present when American forces first encountered concentration camp survivors. He saw the walking skeletons, the mass graves, the systematic evidence of industrial murder. And each time he saw these horrors, he would think about the photographs in his possession. The man having tea on the terrace had ordered this. The officials relaxing in casual clothes had implemented this. The disconnect remained profound, incomprehensible. In November 1945, Martin shipped home. He arrived in New York Harbor in December, was processed through Camp Kilmer in New Jersey, received his discharge papers, and took a train back to Ohio. He carried the photo album in his duffel bag, wrapped carefully in a spare shirt to protect it. He had decided, somewhere during the long journey home, that he would not tell anyone about it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. His family welcomed him home. His mother wept. His father shook his hand and told him he was proud. His younger brother, too young to have served, asked endless questions about combat, questions Martin mostly deflected. His girlfriend, Sarah, who had waited for him through 3 years of war, kissed him at the train station and told him she'd never let him go again. He married Sarah in March 1946. He used his GI Bill benefits to attend college. He got a degree in history, which surprised his family, who had expected him to go into business or agriculture. But the war had changed what interested him. He wanted to understand what had happened, how the 20th century had produced such catastrophe, whether history could explain human evil or only chronicle it. He became a high school history teacher in Cleveland. He taught American history, European history, government. He was a good teacher, patient, knowledgeable, willing to engage with difficult questions. His students liked him. He had a reputation for making history relevant, for connecting past events to present concerns. And in his home office, in a locked filing cabinet, he kept Hitler's photo album. Sarah knew about it. He'd told her within the first year of their marriage. She'd looked through it once, disturbed by the casual intimacy of the images, and asked him what he planned to do with it. He'd said he didn't know. She'd suggested he donate it to a museum. He'd said maybe someday. They'd had that conversation several times over the years. His answer never changed. His children, 2 daughters and a son, born between 1947 and 1954, grew up unaware that their father possessed one of the most unusual private collections of Nazi photographs in existence. Martin never mentioned it. When they asked about the war, which they did periodically, he told them the same stories most veterans told. Sanitized versions. Heroic narratives with the trauma removed. He didn't talk about the men he'd killed. He didn't talk about the concentration camps. And he certainly didn't talk about what he'd taken from the Berghof. Through the 1950s and 60s, as Holocaust awareness grew, as historians published detailed accounts of Nazi crimes, as survivors wrote memoirs and gave testimonies, Martin read everything he could find. He attended lectures. He watched documentaries. He tried to understand the system he had helped to defeat. And each time he learned something new about the machinery of the Holocaust, about the specific decisions made by specific individuals, he would take out the photo album and look at the faces of those individuals in relaxed, casual moments. There was Himmler, smiling at something off camera. Himmler, who had overseen the SS, the Gestapo, the concentration camp system. In the photograph, he looked like someone's awkward uncle. Goering, who had built the Luftwaffe, who had looted art from across Europe, who had been convicted at Nuremberg and committed suicide before he could be hanged. In the photograph, he looked jovial, well-fed, holding what appeared to be a beer. The cognitive dissonance never resolved. The photographs showed human beings. The historical record showed monsters. Both were true. Martin's training as a historian told him that understanding this paradox was essential. Evil people are still people. Monsters are made, not born. The Nazis were not alien creatures. They were humans who made terrible choices, who built a system of industrialized murder, who convinced themselves they were serving a higher purpose. But knowing this intellectually didn't make it easier to look at the photographs. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In 1961, Martin attended a lecture at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. The speaker was a Holocaust survivor, a woman who had been at Auschwitz, who had lost her entire family. She spoke about memory, about the importance of documentation, about the need to preserve evidence of what had happened so that denial would be impossible. Martin sat in the audience and felt the weight of the photo album in his filing cabinet. He thought about approaching the speaker after the lecture, telling her what he had, offering to donate it. But he didn't. He walked to his car and drove home in silence. Sarah asked how the lecture had been. He said it was powerful. She asked if he'd thought about the photo album. He said yes. She didn't push further. Through the 1970s, as his children grew up and moved away, as he continued teaching, as he and Sarah settled into the rhythms of middle age, the photo album remained in its locked cabinet. Martin took it out less frequently now. Sometimes months would pass without him looking at it. But he always knew it was there. It had become a kind of talisman, a physical connection to the most significant event of his life, the war that had shaped everything that came after. His students, when they studied World War II, would sometimes ask him about his experiences. He would tell them limited stories. The jump into Normandy, the cold at Bastogne, the feeling of entering Germany in 1945. But he never mentioned the Berghof. He never mentioned what he'd found there. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Martin, now 67 years old and nearing retirement from teaching, watched the coverage on television with a mixture of triumph and melancholy. The Cold War that had followed the war he'd fought was ending. The division of Europe, the aftermath of Nazi defeat, was being resolved. He thought about the photo album. He thought about whether its historical value had changed now that the context of the war was shifting again. He retired from teaching in 1990. Sarah, who had been diagnosed with breast cancer in 1987, was in declining health. They spent his retirement traveling modestly, visiting their children and grandchildren, trying to make the most of the time they had left together. The photo album stayed in its cabinet. Sarah died in 1993. Martin, alone now in the house they'd shared for almost 50 years, found himself taking out the photo album more frequently. Not to study it, but simply to hold it. This object had been with him longer than almost anything else in his life. Longer than his marriage. Longer than his career. It was a physical link to his youth, to the war, to the person he'd been before combat had changed him. His children, going through the house to help him sort through Sarah's belongings, never found it. He'd moved it by then to a safe deposit box at his bank. He told himself this was for security. But it was also a way of ensuring they wouldn't discover it accidentally, wouldn't ask questions he still wasn't ready to answer. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of V-Day, Martin attended a reunion of the 101st Airborne. Men now in their 70s, many using canes or walkers, gathered to remember their fallen comrades and share stories that had become polished smooth with decades of retelling. Martin enjoyed these reunions. The camaraderie was real, the shared experience unique. But he never told his fellow veterans about the photo album. This secret had been his alone for so long that sharing it felt impossible. It was at that reunion that something shifted. A historian from the U.S. Army Center of Military History was present, collecting oral histories from veterans. Martin agreed to an interview. He talked about his service, his combat experiences, his thoughts about the war's legacy. And at the end of the interview, almost on impulse, he mentioned that he had taken something from the Berghof in 1945. The historian's interest was immediate. What had he taken? Was it documents? Military papers? Martin hesitated, then said it was a personal photo album that had apparently belonged to Hitler. The historian asked if he could see it. Martin said he'd think about it. That conversation was the beginning of the end of the secret. Martin, now 73 years old, began to consider seriously for the first time what should happen to the photo album after his death. His children would inherit it, assuming they found it, but they would have no context, no understanding of what it was or where it had come from. It might end up in an estate sale, purchased by a collector, disappearing into private hands again. Or he could donate it, give it to a museum or a historical archive where scholars could study it, where it could be properly preserved and contextualized. This was what Sarah had always suggested. This was what every historian would recommend. But doing so would mean explaining how he'd obtained it, why he'd kept it secret for 50 years, and possibly facing questions about whether he'd had the right to take it in the first place. The legal question haunted Martin more than he liked to admit. In 1945, the chaos of Germany's collapse had created a gray area around what soldiers could and couldn't take. The official policy was clear in theory. Soldiers could keep items of insignificant value as souvenirs, but looting was forbidden, particularly of items that might have intelligence value or cultural significance. But in practice, the distinction was blurry. Was a Nazi flag looting or a souvenir? Was a German officer's pistol evidence or a trophy? Was a personal photo album from Hitler's residence a historical document or just pictures? Martin had convinced himself over the decades that his taking of the album wasn't theft in any meaningful sense. The Berghof had already been partially destroyed by Allied bombing. SS guards had abandoned it. Other soldiers were taking items. The building would be picked over by intelligence teams, then probably destroyed completely. If he hadn't taken the album, someone else would have, or it would have been lost in the general chaos. But this rationalization, however reasonable, didn't eliminate his anxiety about potential consequences. Even 50 years later, he worried that coming forward might result in prosecution, however unlikely. He worried that his reputation, his career as a teacher, his standing in his community, might be damaged by revelations that he'd been keeping Nazi materials in his home for 5 decades. He worried that his children would be embarrassed or shocked. Most of all, he worried about how the album itself would be interpreted. These were not propaganda photographs. They were intimate glimpses of Hitler's private life. And Martin had come to believe over the years that there was something dangerous about humanizing a man. Not because Hitler shouldn't be understood as human. Understanding the humanity of perpetrators was essential to understanding how atrocities happen, but because these particular images might be misused. They might feed into revisionist narratives. They might be reproduced sensationally by tabloids. They might become collector's items for neo-Nazis. This concern wasn't paranoid. Martin had watched over the decades as Nazi memorabilia had become a disturbing market. Items that soldiers had taken as souvenirs in 1945 now sold for thousands of dollars to collectors, some of them serious historians, others clearly motivated by admiration for the Third Reich. The idea that photographs from Hitler's personal album might end up framed on some neo-Nazi's wall made Martin physically ill. So through the 1990s, the album remained in the safe deposit box. Martin visited it periodically, renewing the box annually, but never taking it home. It existed in a kind of limbo, neither hidden nor revealed, neither destroyed nor shared. In 1997, something happened that forced Martin's hand. A documentary filmmaker working on a project about Hitler's private life contacted several veterans of the 101st Airborne, asking if any of them had been present at the Berghof in May 1945. The filmmaker had heard rumors, impossible to verify, that various personal items from Hitler's residence had been taken by American soldiers and never turned over to authorities. Martin received a letter from the filmmaker. It was polite, professional, explaining the project and asking if Martin had any memories of the Berghof or knowledge of items that had been taken. Martin didn't respond, but the letter sat on his desk for weeks. He read it multiple times. He discussed it with his oldest daughter, Elizabeth, who had become a lawyer. She asked him directly if he had taken anything from the Berghof. He told her about the photo album. Elizabeth's reaction was complex. She was shocked that her father had kept this secret through her entire life. She was concerned about the legal implications. But she was also, as a student of history herself, fascinated by what the album might contain. She asked to see it. Martin, after decades of keeping the album secret even from his own family, agreed. They went to the bank together. Martin opened the safe deposit box. He'd kept the album wrapped in acid-free paper, having learned enough about preservation to protect it properly. He unwrapped it carefully and handed it to his daughter. Elizabeth spent an hour looking through the photographs. She saw what her father had seen 52 years earlier. Hitler at the Berghof in casual dress. Eva Braun, whom most people in 1997 knew little about, smiling and relaxed. Nazi officials in unguarded moments. In the older photographs, Hitler is a young man, images from the early days of the Nazi Party. When she finished, she looked at her father and said something that surprised him. This needs to be in a museum, not for Nazi sympathizers, not for sensationalism, but because understanding how these people saw themselves, how they lived, is part of understanding how the Holocaust happened. Martin argued with her. He raised all his concerns. The legal risks, the possibility of misuse, the question of whether humanizing Hitler served any legitimate historical purpose. Elizabeth countered each point. The legal risks, she argued as a lawyer, were minimal at this point. 50-plus years had passed. He'd been a soldier in a combat zone. No prosecutor would pursue charges. As for misuse, that risk existed for any historical material. It couldn't be a reason to hide evidence. And regarding humanization, she was firm. The Nazis weren't monsters from mythology, she said. They were humans who did monstrous things. Understanding that is essential. They talked for hours. They didn't reach agreement that day. Martin took the album back to the safe deposit box. But something had shifted. For the first time in 50 years, he'd shared the secret with someone else. The burden of solitary knowledge had lifted slightly. Over the next year, Martin began consulting with historians. He contacted the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He spoke with archivists at the National Archives. He reached out to military historians who specialized in World War II. In each conversation, he was careful not to reveal too much, asking hypothetical questions about the legal and ethical issues around wartime souvenirs. The responses he received were consistent. Historians wanted access to any materials related to Nazi leadership. The legal risks for a veteran who had taken items in 1945 were essentially non-existent. And the ethical obligation, most argued, was to preservation and scholarship, not to concealment. In 1998, Martin made his decision. He would donate the photo album to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, but he would do so with conditions. The album would be restricted for research use only, not displayed publicly in a way that might sensationalize it. The museum would need to provide proper historical context, and Martin's identity would be protected. He didn't want media attention or public scrutiny. The museum agreed to these terms. In June 1998, 53 years after he'd taken it from the Berghof, Martin hand-delivered Hitler's personal photo album to the museum in Washington. He met with the chief curator. He provided a detailed written account of how and where he'd found the album. He answered questions about the condition of the Berghof, about other items soldiers had taken, about his memories of those chaotic days in May 1945. The curator was professional, grateful, careful not to press Martin on why he'd waited so long. They both understood that the delay, while regrettable from a historical standpoint, was also entirely human. Martin had been young when he found the album, uncertain about rules and consequences. He'd made a choice to keep it, then found himself trapped by that choice for decades. The longer he waited to come forward, the harder it became to explain the wait. The museum's conservation team examined the album carefully. Despite having been moved multiple times, stored in various conditions, kept in a filing cabinet and later safe deposit box, the album was in remarkably good condition. Martin's care in wrapping it, his decision to move it to a bank vault, had helped preserve it. The photographs themselves were intact, the leather binding undamaged, the pages clean. What made the album historically significant wasn't just its provenance, the fact that it came from Hitler's personal residence. It was the content. These photographs filled gaps in the historical record of Hitler's private life. Some of the images of Eva Braun were particularly valuable. She had been kept largely secret during the Nazi years, and photographs of her were relatively rare in 1998. The casual images of Nazi officials provided insight into the social dynamics of Hitler's inner circle, and the older photographs offered glimpses of Hitler's pre-power years. The museum assigned researchers to catalog and analyze every photograph. They cross-referenced images with known photographs to verify authenticity. They consulted with other institutions, particularly in Germany, to establish provenance and historical context. The conclusion was unanimous. This was genuine. This was significant. And this had been hidden from scholars for over half a century. Martin, true to his wishes, remained anonymous. The museum publicly announced the acquisition of a significant collection of photographs from Hitler's personal residence, donated by a World War II veteran who wished to remain unnamed. There was media coverage, but it was relatively muted. The late 1990s saw regular new revelations about Nazi history as archives were opened and private collections were discovered. This was important, but not sensational. What Martin hadn't anticipated was the emotional impact of letting go. For 53 years, the photo album had been his secret, his burden, his connection to the most significant period of his life. Now it was gone. He felt relief, certainly. The legal and ethical questions that had haunted him were resolved. But he also felt a sense of loss. The album had been a physical link to his youth, to the war, to the person he'd been before combat had changed him forever. His children, now all adults with children of their own, had mixed reactions when he finally told them the full story. Elizabeth, who had known for a year, was supportive. His other daughter, Margaret, was confused about why he'd kept it secret for so long, particularly from their mother during her lifetime. His son, James, was fascinated by the historical aspects, but troubled by his father's decision to keep it hidden. The family conversations that followed were difficult. Martin tried to explain his reasoning, the confusion of a 23-year-old soldier, the growing anxiety as years passed, the fear of consequences, the uncertainty about what to do. His children tried to understand, but the generational gap was significant. They'd grown up in a different America, one where Holocaust education was standard, where Nazi crimes were thoroughly documented, where the idea of hiding historical materials seemed inexplicable. But as they talked, as Martin shared more details about his war experiences, about the things he'd seen in those final months of fighting, about entering concentration camps, about the psychological toll of combat, his children began to understand that the photo album was connected to trauma. Martin had never fully processed what he'd experienced in Europe. Like many veterans of his generation, he'd come home, gone to college, gotten married, built a career, and tried to forget. The photo album had been both a reminder of that trauma and a kind of protection against it, holding on to it meant he controlled it, rather than it controlling him. In 1999, Martin received a letter from a historian at Cambridge University who was writing a book about daily life in Nazi Germany's leadership circles. The historian had been granted access to the photo album at the Holocaust Memorial Museum and wanted to interview Martin about the circumstances of its discovery. Martin agreed, with the condition that he remain anonymous in any published work. The interview took place at Martin's home in Ohio. The historian, a woman named Dr. Sarah Morrison, was in her 40s, part of a generation of scholars who had grown up after the war and approached Nazi history with academic rigor rather than personal memory. She asked detailed questions about the Berghof, about its condition in May 1945, about what other rooms Martin had seen, about what other soldiers had taken. Martin answered as best he could, but his memories after 54 years were imperfect. He remembered the general layout of the building, the destruction from bombing, the sense of unreality walking through spaces where Hitler had lived. But specific details had faded. He couldn't remember exactly which room the album had been in, only that it was on the second floor in a study or office. He couldn't remember if there had been other photo albums, though he thought there might have been. Dr. Morrison was interested in why Martin had kept the album secret. This was, she explained, part of a larger pattern. Many American soldiers had taken items from Nazi sites, Berchtesgaden, various Nazi headquarters, concentration camps, and many had kept these items hidden for decades. The reasons varied: legal anxiety, shame at having taken them, uncertainty about their value, but the pattern was consistent. Materials that could have aided historical understanding immediately after the war had instead been dispersed into private hands and kept secret. Martin found himself defensive. He tried to explain that the context in 1945 was different, that the rules were unclear, that he'd been young and uncertain. Dr. Morrison was sympathetic, but also academically honest. The delay had hurt historical scholarship, she said gently. But the eventual donation helped. She thanked him for coming forward, even if it had taken decades. After she left, Martin sat in his living room and thought about her words. The delay had hurt historical scholarship. He'd known this intellectually, but hearing it stated so directly was painful. He'd made a choice in 1945, then made the same choice repeatedly for over 50 years. Each time he decided not to come forward was another choice. And those choices had consequences. But he also knew, sitting there at age 77, that he would have made the same decisions again. This wasn't because he thought they were right. It was because at each moment of decision, the factors that led him to keep the album secret, fear, uncertainty, inertia, had outweighed the abstract obligation to historical scholarship. It was easy in hindsight to say he should have donated the album immediately. It was much harder to recreate the mindset of a 23-year-old combat veteran trying to navigate the chaos of post-war return. The book Dr. Morrison was writing was published in 2001. It included a chapter about Hitler's life at the Berghof, drawing heavily on the photographs from Martin's album. She kept her promise. Martin appeared in the text only as an anonymous American veteran who had donated the material in 1998. The book was well-reviewed and widely read in academic circles. Martin bought a copy and read the chapter about the Berghof multiple times. He saw reproductions of photographs he'd looked at hundreds of times over 50 years, now with captions and historical context. Hitler with his German shepherd, identified as Blondie. Eva Braun sunbathing, dated to summer 1943 based on other evidence. Nazi officials at a social gathering, each person identified by name and position. Seeing the photographs in this context, properly analyzed and explained, confirmed for Martin that he'd made the right decision to donate them. But it also drove home what Dr. Morrison had said. If he'd donated the album in 1945 or even in the 1950s or 60s, scholars would have had access to this material decades earlier. Research that relied on these images could have been conducted sooner. Understanding of Hitler's private life could have been more complete. He couldn't undo those decades of secrecy. All he could do was accept that his choices, understandable as they were, had been flawed. In 2003, Martin gave an interview to a historian working on an oral history project about World War II veterans. The historian was collecting stories before the generation that had fought the war died out. Martin, now 81, knew he didn't have many years left. He agreed to a comprehensive interview covering his entire service, from enlistment through discharge. For the first time in his life, Martin talked publicly about everything. The jump into Normandy and the terror of landing under fire. The bocage fighting in France and the slow, grinding casualties. Market Garden and the sense that leadership had miscalculated. Bastogne and the cold and the certainty that they might all die there. The final push into Germany and the strange sense of inevitability as the Reich collapsed. And he talked about the concentration camps. This was the part of his experience he'd never discussed with his family, not even with Sarah in their almost 50 years of marriage. He described entering camps that had just been liberated, seeing survivors who barely looked human, seeing the evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. He described the smell, which never left him, the images which appeared in nightmares for decades, the crushing weight of understanding what human beings were capable of doing to other human beings. And he talked about finding the photo album at the Berghof and why he'd kept it secret. He explained that part of his motivation had been legal fear, but another part had been something he struggled to articulate. The album contained evidence that the people who had built the concentration camp system, who had ordered the genocide, who had started the war, were human beings who had dogs and girlfriends and apparently enjoyed mountain scenery. This wasn't a revelation to anyone who thought seriously about history. But to Martin, at 23, recently exposed to the Holocaust's evidence, it had been psychologically destabilizing. He needed the Nazis to be monsters. Learning that they were humans who did monstrous things was harder to process than simply hating them as in human evil. Keeping the album secret had been, in part, a way of controlling that destabilizing knowledge. As long as the photographs remained his private possession, he didn't have to confront what they meant publicly. He could think about them privately, struggle with them alone, and avoid having to explain to anyone else why images of Hitler playing with a dog disturbed him more than images of Hitler at Nazi rallies. The oral history interview lasted 6 hours. The historian conducting it was struck by Martin's honesty and his willingness to examine his own choices critically. The interview was archived and would eventually become part of the historical record, available to future researchers studying the war and its aftermath. Martin died in 2006, age 84, of heart failure. His funeral was attended by his children, grandchildren, fellow veterans, former students, and friends from his decades in Cleveland. The obituary mentioned his World War II service with the 101st Airborne, his career as a history teacher, and his love of learning. It did not mention the photo album. His family had decided that the donation to the Holocaust Memorial Museum was a private matter, not something that needed to be part of his public legacy. But among historians, particularly those specializing in Nazi Germany and Holocaust, Martin's donation had become part of the scholarly conversation. The photographs from Hitler's personal album appeared in multiple books and documentaries in the early 2000s. They were used as teaching materials in Holocaust education programs. They contributed to public understanding of how Nazi leadership functioned, how propaganda constructed Hitler's image, and how the banality of evil manifested in the everyday lives of perpetrators. In 2009, 3 years after Martin's death, the Holocaust Memorial Museum mounted an exhibition about daily life in Nazi Germany. The exhibition included several photographs from Martin's album, displayed with extensive historical context explaining what they showed and why they mattered. The wall text acknowledged that the photographs had been taken from Hitler's Berghof residence by an American soldier in 1945 and donated anonymously in 1998. The exhibition drew large crowds. Visitors were disturbed by the casual intimacy of the images, exactly as Martin had been disturbed 64 years earlier. Comments in the museum's guest book reflected this discomfort. How could people who looked so normal do such evil? Seeing Hitler playing with a dog makes him seem human, which is terrifying. These photographs prove that evil doesn't look like we expect it to. This was precisely the educational value that Elizabeth, Martin's daughter, had argued for back in 1997. Understanding that perpetrators of atrocity are human beings, not supernatural monsters, is essential to preventing future atrocities. If evil only comes from obviously inhuman sources, we can comfort ourselves that we would recognize it and resist it. But if evil can come from people who love dogs and enjoy mountain views, then we must be more vigilant about the systems and ideologies we support, because any of us could potentially participate in atrocity under the right circumstances. Martin had understood this intellectually by the end of his life, but it had taken him decades to move from intellectual understanding to action, from private knowledge to public disclosure. The 53 years between finding the album and donating it represented his personal journey from traumatized young soldier to thoughtful old man willing to contribute to historical understanding even at the cost of revealing his own conflicted relationship with the material. In 2015, a journalist researching a book about items taken from Nazi sites by Allied soldiers managed to identify Martin as the source of the Berghof photo album. The journalist contacted Martin's children, explaining that public records and cross-referencing interviews had led to their father's identity. The journalist wanted to write about Martin's story, the finding of the album, the decades of secrecy, the eventual donation. Martin's children debated how to respond. Their father had wanted anonymity, but he'd also been dead for 9 years. And the journalist argued that Martin's story was itself historically significant, an example of how veterans processed their war experiences and struggled with ethical questions about materials they'd taken. After considerable discussion, Elizabeth, Margaret, and James agreed to cooperate with the journalist. They provided photographs of their father, copies of his military service records, and details about his life. They shared what they knew about his decision-making process regarding the album, and they agreed to be interviewed about their reactions when they'd learned about it. The resulting book, published in 2017, was titled Hitler's Album, An American Soldier's Secret. It told Martin's story in detail, from his combat service through his death. It examined the psychological impact of war, the ethical complexities of wartime souvenirs, and the contribution Martin's eventual donation made to historical scholarship. The book was respectful of Martin's memory, while also being honest about the costs of his 53-year secrecy. Reviews were mixed. Some praised the book for examining the human dimensions of historical preservation. Others criticized Martin, even posthumously, for keeping important historical materials hidden for so long. Holocaust scholars generally fell on the side of appreciating the eventual donation, while acknowledging that earlier disclosure would have been preferable. Martin's grandchildren, reading about their grandfather's experience, had various reactions. Some were proud that he'd eventually done the right thing. Others struggled with the knowledge that he'd kept such significant materials hidden. Several used his story as the basis for school papers about World War II, the Holocaust, and the ethics of historical preservation. The photo album itself remains in the collection of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's available to researchers by appointment, carefully preserved in climate-controlled storage. Selected photographs appear in the museum's permanent exhibition. The album has been digitized, making it accessible to scholars worldwide without risking damage to the original. In the decades since Martin's death, the photographs have appeared in dozens of books, documentaries, and educational materials. They've contributed to public understanding of Hitler's private life, of Eva Braun's role, of the social dynamics among Nazi leadership. They've been analyzed by psychologists studying evil, by sociologists examining authoritarian movements, by historians documenting the Third Reich. None of this would have been possible if Martin had destroyed the album, which he'd apparently considered several times over the years. And none of it would have been as effective if he'd kept it hidden until his death, at which point it might have ended up in an estate sale or been thrown away by descendants who didn't understand its value. His decision to finally donate it, difficult as it had been to make, ensured that the material contributed to education and understanding rather than being lost or misused. The impact of Martin's donation extended far beyond what he could have anticipated when he finally handed over the album in 1998. In the 2 decades following his death, the photographs became central to several important historical debates and educational initiatives that reshaped how scholars and the public understood Nazi leadership. In 2010, a team of psychologists at Yale University began a research project examining the visual representation of authoritarian leaders and how images shape public perception of dictators. The project, funded by the National Science Foundation, compared official propaganda photographs of various 20th century dictators with private, candid images when such images existed. Martin's donated album became a cornerstone of this research because it provided one of the most complete collections of private photographs of any major historical figure associated with genocide. The research findings were striking. Test subjects shown only official Nazi propaganda images of Hitler rated him as appearing cold, distant, and inhuman. These were the carefully staged photographs that showed Hitler as an almost mythological figure, the images that Nazi propagandists had crafted to present him as a leader of destiny. But when shown the candid photographs from Martin's album, the same test subjects used different language. They described Hitler as appearing ordinary, even relatable in some images. This shift in perception was exactly what had disturbed Martin so deeply when he first found the album. The Yale study concluded that one reason authoritarian regimes invest heavily in propaganda imagery is to create psychological distance between leaders and citizens. When leaders appear superhuman or mythological, their actions can be rationalized as beyond normal moral judgment. But candid images that reveal the humanity of such leaders create cognitive dissonance that can be educationally valuable. Understanding that Hitler was human, that he engaged in ordinary activities, that he was capable of affection toward animals, makes his crimes more disturbing, not less. It eliminates the comfortable fiction that only monsters commit atrocities. This research cited Martin's donation as an example of the importance of preserving private historical materials even when they're disturbing or potentially controversial. The study's lead researcher, Dr. Rebecca Chun, wrote in her published findings that if Martin had destroyed the album or kept it hidden until his death, this important psychological research would not have been possible. She acknowledged the complexity of Martin's 53-year delay, but argued that what mattered ultimately was that the material became available for scholarship. In 2012, the German Historical Museum in Berlin requested permission to include several photographs from Martin's album in a major exhibition about daily life in Nazi Germany. The exhibition, titled Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Evil, examined how Nazi officials balanced their roles in implementing genocidal policies with their personal lives, families, hobbies, and social activities. The exhibition was controversial even before it opened. Some critics argued that showing Nazis in casual, human contexts risked normalizing them or generating sympathy. Others countered that understanding how ordinary people participated in extraordinary evil was essential to preventing future atrocities. The debate echoed the internal struggle Martin had experienced for decades. Is there value in seeing perpetrators of genocide as human beings? Or does humanizing them minimize their crimes? The curators of the Berlin exhibition came down firmly on the side of humanization as education. The exhibition materials explained that the Nazis were not monsters from mythology, but humans who made choices, who constructed an ideology that justified mass murder, who convinced themselves they were serving a higher purpose. Understanding this, the curators argued, was essential because it forced viewers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Under certain circumstances, ordinary people can participate in horrific acts. The exhibition drew record crowds in Berlin and later traveled to museums in Munich, Hamburg, and Vienna. In each city, it generated intense public discussion. Some visitors found it deeply unsettling to see photographs of Nazi officials in relaxed moments, doing normal things. Others found it educational precisely because it destroyed the comforting myth that evil is always recognizable, always obviously monstrous. The photographs from Martin's album were among the most discussed pieces in the exhibition because they showed Hitler himself in ways the public had rarely seen. One photograph, in particular, generated extensive commentary. It showed Hitler on the terrace at the Berghof, sitting with his German shepherd Blondie, looking relaxed and almost grandfatherly. The dog's head was resting on Hitler's knee. Hitler was smiling, genuinely smiling, not the forced expression from propaganda photographs, but a natural moment of apparent contentment. Visitors to the exhibition would stand in front of this photograph for long periods, trying to reconcile the image with their knowledge of Hitler's crimes. Museum comment books from the exhibition preserved visitor reactions. How can the person in this photograph be the same person who ordered the Holocaust? One visitor wrote. This photograph disturbs me more than pictures of concentration camps because it shows that evil can look normal, another commented. My grandfather fought against the Nazis. Seeing them look so human makes me understand why my grandfather never wanted to talk about the war, a third visitor reflected. These reactions validated Elizabeth's argument to her father back in 1997. The photographs had educational value precisely because they were disturbing. They forced viewers to confront the banality of evil, to understand that perpetrators of atrocity don't announce themselves as monsters, but often appear as ordinary people engaged in ordinary activities. In 2014, a documentary filmmaker named David Rosenberg began work on a project about American soldiers who had taken items from Nazi sites and the psychological impact of possessing such materials. Rosenberg had learned about Martin's story from the 2017 book and wanted to explore it more deeply. He interviewed Martin's children extensively, viewed the oral history interview Martin had given in 2003, and spoke with historians who had used the photographs from the donated album. The resulting documentary, titled The Burden of History, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2016 and was later broadcast on PBS. It told Martin's story, but also the stories of several other veterans who had taken Nazi materials and struggled with what to do with them. One veteran had taken documents from a Nazi headquarters that turned out to contain evidence of war crimes. He kept them hidden for 40 years before finally contacting prosecutors in Germany. Another had taken a Nazi flag that he'd eventually burned, unable to bear having it in his house. A third had taken a dagger that he'd given to his son, who had donated it to a museum after his father's death. The documentary explored common themes across these stories. Veterans who took items in the chaos of 1945 often did so impulsively, without thinking through the implications. Many experienced guilt about taking the items, but also felt possessive of them. These objects represented their participation in defeating Nazism and were tangible proof of their service. The longer they kept the items, the harder it became to come forward because they had to explain not just the original taking, but decades of secrecy. And most struggled with questions about whether their possession of Nazi materials somehow tainted them or their families. Martin's story was presented as particularly complex because what he'd taken had significant historical value, but also felt deeply personal and disturbing to him. The documentary included interviews with his children discussing their reactions when they learned about the album. Elizabeth spoke movingly about her father's internal conflict, his desire to do the right thing balanced against his fear of consequences and his discomfort with the material itself. James discussed how learning about the album had changed his understanding of his father, revealing depths of experience and moral struggle he hadn't known existed. Margaret talked about wishing her father had felt able to share this burden with her mother rather than carrying it alone for so long. The documentary also included analysis from trauma specialists who explained that many World War II veterans returned home with unprocessed psychological wounds. The generation that fought the war was not offered the kind of mental health support that would become standard for later generations of veterans. They were expected to simply resume normal life, to put the war behind them and move forward. In this context, keeping a physical object from the war, particularly an object that represented the enemy they defeated, could serve as a way of maintaining some control over traumatic memories. The object became a container for experiences too difficult to discuss or fully process. This analysis helped Martin's children understand their father's choices more sympathetically. It wasn't that he'd been hiding something shameful, though he'd felt shame. It was that the album had become bound up with his war trauma, and dealing with it meant confronting experiences he'd spent decades trying to compartmentalize. His eventual donation represented not just a resolution of ethical questions about the album's proper home, but also a step in his own psychological healing, belated though it was. The documentary was widely praised for its nuanced treatment of a difficult subject. It neither condemned veterans who had kept Nazi materials nor ignored the costs of such secrecy to historical scholarship. It presented the situation as genuinely complex, full of competing legitimate concerns, and it honored the difficulty of the choices these men had faced. In 2018, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum organized a symposium titled Preserving Difficult Histories: Materials from Perpetrators and Collaborators. The symposium brought together archivists, historians, museum professionals, and ethicists to discuss how institutions should handle materials related to genocide and other atrocities. The photograph album Martin had donated was discussed as a case study. Several important points emerged from the symposium discussions. First, materials from perpetrators, while disturbing, are essential to understanding how atrocities occur. Studying only victim testimonies and general historical accounts provides an incomplete picture. Understanding how perpetrators thought, how they justified their actions, how they lived their daily lives, is necessary for comprehensive historical understanding. Second, such materials must always be presented with proper context. Displaying photographs of Nazi officials in casual settings without explanation risks misinterpretation or even glorification by extremist groups. Museums and archives have an obligation to frame such materials in ways that emphasize their educational purpose and historical significance. Third, institutions must balance preservation with sensitivity to survivors and their descendants. Some Holocaust survivors and their families found the display of personal Nazi materials deeply painful, a reminder of the humanity of people who had destroyed their families. Museums needed to acknowledge this pain while also arguing for the historical necessity of preserving and studying such materials. Fourth, the delay in many items coming to light, Martin's album being just one example, had created gaps in historical scholarship that could never be fully recovered. Researchers in the 1950s and 60s who could have used these materials didn't have access to them. This represented a real cost, even though the eventual donations were valuable. The symposium participants drafted guidelines for how institutions should handle donations of materials from Nazi sources. These guidelines emphasize the importance of documenting provenance, establishing clear usage policies, providing historical context, and maintaining sensitivity to the ongoing impact of the Holocaust on survivors and descendants. Martin's donation was cited as largely following these principles, though the decades-long delay remained problematic. In 2019, researchers at the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation, which houses extensive testimony from Holocaust survivors, began a project to cross-reference survivor testimonies with materials like Martin's photograph album. The goal was to provide additional context for both the testimonies and the photographs. For example, survivors who had been at Berchtesgaden as forced laborers had described seeing Hitler and other Nazi officials at the Berghof. Their testimonies could now be compared with the photographic evidence of what life at the Berghof looked like during the same period. This kind of triangulation, comparing different types of historical evidence, strengthened the historical record. It allowed researchers to verify details, identify inconsistencies, and build a more complete picture of the past. Several survivors who reviewed photographs from Martin's album as part of this project had emotional reactions. Some expressed anger at the casual comfort shown in the images while they and millions of others were suffering. Others found the photographs valuable as confirmation of their memories. One survivor, who had worked as a laborer on the grounds of the Berghof, was able to identify specific locations in the photographs and provide additional context about when certain images might have been taken based on seasonal details in the backgrounds. This research produced several important scholarly papers that combined survivor testimony with photographic evidence and other documentary sources to create detailed reconstructions of specific time periods and locations in Nazi Germany. Martin's contribution, though delayed, became part of this larger, scholarly project of comprehensive historical documentation. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Holocaust Memorial Museum made significant portions of its collection available online for virtual education. The photographs from Martin's album were included in this digital initiative, allowing teachers around the world to incorporate them into lessons about World War II and the Holocaust. The museum provided extensive educational materials to accompany the photographs, explaining their historical context and addressing the ethical questions they raised. Teachers reported that students found the casual nature of the photographs particularly impactful. Students who had become somewhat desensitized to images of atrocity, having seen documentary footage of concentration camps in multiple classes over multiple years, responded differently to photographs of Nazi officials looking ordinary and human. The cognitive dissonance forced them to think more deeply about how the Holocaust happened, not as some inevitable outcome of obviously evil people doing obviously evil things, but as the result of systems and ideologies that ordinary people chose to support or participate in. One high school teacher in New Jersey wrote to the museum describing how she used the photographs in a lesson about moral responsibility. She showed students the casual images of Hitler and Nazi officials, then shared statistics about the Holocaust, then asked students to discuss how the same people in the photographs could be responsible for the statistics. The discussions, she reported, were among the most engaged and thoughtful her students had all year. They wrestled with questions about human nature, about how societies can go wrong, about individual responsibility within larger systems, about whether they themselves could ever participate in something evil while still seeing themselves as good people going about their ordinary lives. This was exactly the kind of education that Martin's donation enabled. The photographs became teaching tools that helped new generations grapple with difficult historical and moral questions. They contributed to Holocaust education in ways that complemented but didn't replace survivor testimony, historical documentation, and other educational approaches. In 2021, Martin's grandson, David, who had become a documentary filmmaker himself, began work on a personal film about his grandfather's war experience and the photo album. David had been 12 when Martin died and had only vague memories of him. Learning about the album through the 2017 book and the 2016 documentary had sparked his interest in understanding his grandfather more deeply. David interviewed his mother, Elizabeth, extensively, reviewed all the available materials about Martin's service, visited the places in Europe where Martin had fought, including the site where the Berghof had stood, and spent time with the photo album itself at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. His resulting film, completed in 2023, was titled Grandfather's Secret and took a personal, reflective approach to the story. The film explored questions of intergenerational trauma and memory. David examined how his grandfather's war experiences had shaped his father's childhood, even though Martin rarely spoke about the war directly. He interviewed family members about Martin's personality, his teaching career, his relationships with his children and grandchildren. He tried to understand the man behind the soldier, the person who had carried this secret for more than half his life. The film included a scene where David, holding the photo album at the museum, tried to imagine what his grandfather had felt when he first opened it in the Berghof in 1945. A 23-year-old who had seen combat, who had witnessed concentration camps, who was trying to make sense of what he'd experienced, finding this intimate glimpse into the private life of the man responsible for so much suffering. David reflected that he couldn't fully understand his grandfather's reaction, but that trying to understand it had given him insight into the lasting impacts of war on those who fight and on the generations that follow. The film premiered at several film festivals and was eventually distributed through educational channels. It received praise for its personal approach to a historical subject and for its honest examination of family history and memory. Several reviewers noted that by focusing on Martin as a person rather than just as a soldier who found a historically significant item, the film humanized the broader story of veterans dealing with war's aftermath. In 2024, Nearly 80 years after Martin found the photo album and 26 years after he donated it, the album remained an active subject of scholarly research and educational use. New books continued to incorporate the photographs. New documentaries used them to illustrate points about Nazi leadership or World War II history. Teachers continued to use them in classrooms around the world. And researchers continued to find new insights by comparing them with other sources and analyzing them with new methodological approaches. The story of Martin's 53-year delay in donating the album also remained relevant. It appeared regularly in discussions about the ethics of wartime souvenirs, the preservation of difficult historical materials, and the psychological impacts of war on veterans. Scholars studying these topics often cited Martin's case as illustrative of the complex factors that can lead people to make choices that seem inexplicable to others, but are understandable within the context of individual experience and circumstance. Martin's children, now in their 70s and 80s themselves, occasionally gave interviews about their father's story. They spoke with pride about his eventual decision to donate the album, with understanding about the factors that delayed that decision, and with hope that his story might help others in similar situations come forward with historically valuable materials. They emphasized that their father had been a good man who had struggled with a difficult situation and had ultimately done what he believed was right. The final assessment of Martin's actions remained complex. Historians acknowledge that his delay in donating the album had cost for scholarship. Research that could have been done in the 1950s or 60s was delayed or never happened because the material wasn't available. But they also acknowledged that his eventual donation had significant value and that the album had contributed substantially to historical understanding. Ethicists debated whether Martin's 53 years of secrecy was a moral failing or simply a human response to a difficult situation. Psychologists noted that his behavior was consistent with trauma responses common among combat veterans. Perhaps the most balanced assessment came from Dr. Sarah Morrison, the Cambridge historian who had interviewed Martin in 1999. In a 2023 article reflecting on the 25th anniversary of Martin's donation, she wrote, "William Martin's story reminds us that history is made by humans, and humans are complex. He made choices we might wish he had made differently, particularly his decision to keep the album hidden for so long. But he also made the choice, eventually, to contribute to historical understanding. We can acknowledge both the costs of his delay and the value of his donation. We can understand his motivations without excusing all his choices. And we can be grateful that the album ultimately found its way to an institution where it could serve educational purposes rather than being lost, destroyed, or misused. This balanced view seemed appropriate for a story that had never been simple. Martin had not been a villain who deliberately kept important historical materials from the world. But neither had he been a hero who immediately recognized the album's significance and donated it. He had been a young man who found something disturbing and significant, who made a choice to keep it, who found himself trapped by that choice for decades, and who eventually found a way to do what he believed was right. The photo album itself, now nearly 80 years old, remained in excellent condition thanks to the museum's preservation efforts. It would likely survive for centuries, available to future historians, educators, and members of the public who wanted to understand the Nazi era more deeply. The photographs it contained would continue to disturb viewers, to challenge comfortable assumptions about evil, to force engagement with difficult questions about human nature and moral responsibility. And Martin's story would remain attached to the album, a reminder that historical materials don't simply exist in archives waiting to be discovered. They are found by individuals who make choices about what to do with them, choices shaped by personal history, psychological factors, social contexts, and ethical reasoning. Understanding how materials make their way from historical events to research institutions requires understanding these human dimensions of preservation and disclosure. In the end, Martin's grandson David perhaps expressed it best in his documentary's closing narration. "My grandfather carried a burden for 53 years. It was a burden of knowledge, of moral uncertainty, of connection to the worst period of human history. When he finally put that burden down, when he donated the album to the museum, He freed himself, but also contributed something valuable to the world's understanding of how the Holocaust happened. I never got to ask him if he had regrets about waiting so long. But I hope, wherever he is, he knows that what he eventually did mattered. The photographs he preserved have taught millions of people important lessons about evil, about humanity, about the choices we all face when confronted with difficult knowledge. That's a legacy worth having, even if it took a lifetime to create. The photographs from Hitler's personal album, found by a young soldier in the chaos of Nazi Germany's collapse, kept secret for half a century, finally donated when that soldier was an old man, continued their work of education and disturbing revelation. They remained powerful precisely because they were intimate and ordinary, because they showed the perpetrators of history's most systematic genocide as humans engaged in everyday activities. And they stood as testament to one veteran's long journey from confusion and fear to understanding and contribution, a journey that reflected the complexity of human moral reasoning and the lasting impacts of war on those who fight it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.